When fear consumes you and seizes you, all your ability to think rationally evaporates, doesn't it? Life becomes overwhelming, and the promises of God are thrown out the window. Do you remember when Moses sent the spies into Canaan to gather information for the people of Israel? Fear of the looming giants became much more visible than any of the blessings Canaan had to offer. Their report focused on all the seemingly impossible obstacles they faced. As the spies exaggerated and gave the worst report possible, they compared themselves to grasshoppers and claimed the land would devour them. We see this in Numbers chapter 13, verses 32 and 33. This fearful exaggeration infected the Israelites, so much so that they wished they had died in the wilderness. It seems that Israel forgot God's promise to give them the land of Canaan, despite the obstacles that looked so intimidating. The same happens to us as well. When we're gripped by fear, we forget God's promises. But in those moments of fear and panic, God is whispering His promises to us. Are we listening? So I say, let's prepare ourselves for battle. Don't let the enemy use fear to seize you and to take you captive. Fight him off with the promises of God's word and His unchanging character. When fear begins to creep in and all the what-if situations begin to consume your mind, here are a few things that we must remember. And the first one is God's truth. Is what I'm thinking about really happening? Or is it just my imagination running wild? Paul reminds us to dwell on what is true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, commendable, excellent, praiseworthy. We see this in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8. The next thing we must remember is God's presence. We can be comforted remembering that we are not alone. God is with us. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Psalm 46:1. Another thing to remember is God's grace. God promises to provide us with His all-sufficient grace for every trial that comes our way. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Another thing to remember is God's sovereignty. God is in control over every situation in our lives. Daniel 4:35 says, "All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and He does according to His will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay His hand or say to Him, 'What have you done?'" Another thing to remember is God's listening ear. Psalm 40 and verse 1 encourages us to pour out our hearts to God in prayer. And it says, "I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry." Another thing to remember is God's trustworthiness. Psalm 56 with verses 3 and 4 says, "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" Another thing to remember is God's big picture plan. No matter how awful this trial may seem, God promises to use everything together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. Romans 8:28. We may not see the good in our situation at the time, but we can trust God has a hidden smile behind the dark cloud. So, when your child is diagnosed with cancer, or you just learned of a loved one in a car accident, or your husband comes home with news that he was let go from his job, prepare yourself for battle. Don't let the enemy use fear to seize you and take you captive. Fight him off with the promises of God's word in His unchanging character.